First of all, I'd like to thank HRF for inviting me, and I'm particularly honored that I've been invited to speak at the memorial of Balagopal, who of course was a very remarkable human being, an incredible combination of a brilliant intellectual, a very courageous activist, and a very powerful organizer. And of course, a defender and promoter of human rights, not just in India, but everywhere. And we all know what he would have felt and what he would have thought about what is happening today with regard to the Israeli genocide against the Palestinians. I am not going to speak about the evolution of India-Israel relations, and I'm not going to speak about the similarities and contrasts between Hindutva and Zionism. But I will be very happy to take up any questions or comments about these two issues in the discussion afterwards. What I will speak about is give a general historical sketch of the Israel-Palestinian issue up to October 7th, why that happened, what's happening now, and the way forward for Palestinians. But let me start by talking about how Israel is unique in the world, like no other country. It is unique. Number one, it has carrying out the longest running illegal military occupation of the last 150 years, sustained by the most brutal forms of overt and covert violence. It has, in the World War I and World War II, no specific area, no city has suffered as much bomb tonnage, over 70,000 pounds of tonnage, as what Gaza has suffered. It is more than what was dropped on Dresden, on London, and Hamburg put together. The number of people killed or injured in Gaza, and I am counting also those who are missing, mostly killed under the rubble, is over 8% of the population of Gaza. Leave aside the thousands killed in the West Bank. Do you know what 8% is? If in India you talk about 8% of the people killed or injured, it would amount to over 10 crores. That's what we are talking about here. Israel, number two, in proportion to its population, has more political prisoners than any other country in the world. In proportion to population, the USA has the most prisoners. But when you're talking about political prisoners, in proportion to population, Israel is number one. And in many years, it is number one in terms of the absolute number of political prisoners. Israel, a so-called democracy, has what is called the administrative detention law, which, you will be surprised, is worse than WAPA in India. It's worse. 6 months taken in, extended in military courts indefinitely. Over 70% of all families of Palestinians have had one or more members that have been arrested. It is worse than WAPA because you don't even have to give a charge sheet. You just go straight to the military court. You do not have to give evidence to the other side. Huh? And yet, you can do all this here. Other countries, other nations have an army. Israel is an army with a nation. Yes. No political government of Israel will seriously criticize what the army does. Not only politically is it so important, and militarily it is so important, it is very important economically. In 2023, Israel's sales of defense-related equipment, I'm not talking about cyber, which is also a lot, defense-related equipment was over $13 billion. And these are sold to something like 102 countries, including Arab governments. This is something that is extraordinary. Army with a nation, they have compulsory conscription for men and women there. Because they need it? No, but to maintain the idea that Israel is under siege. Its existence is threatened. In other words, to create a garrison mentality for a garrison state. Third, Fourth, no other country has so assiduously cultivated and promoted the myth of its perpetual victimhood. Israel is under threat. Israel's existence is under threat. Arey Baba, you are talking about a country whose professional armed forces are strong enough to take on all the Arab countries' armies together and defeat them. It is the only country in that region that has nuclear weapons. And it is backed by the most powerful military power in the world, the United States, and it goes on and on and on about how its existence is threatened. And you have so many people, India, elsewhere in the media, and so on, saying yes, yes, yes. It's extraordinary. In one respect, Israel is not number one, it is number two. Which country has the largest, longest wall in the world? The Great Wall of China. There is what is called the Green Line, which separates Israel from the occupied territories, the West Bank, which is about 340, 350 kilometers. They have a wall there which is now more than twice as long as that wall, that distance, and is only 80%, 75, 80% filled, still more. It is the second longest wall in the world, and it is so long because it is going in to the West Bank and taking more and more territory and land here. 6, I think. Israel is the only country in the world which is a member of the UN but does not give the UN a map which clearly defines its boundaries. It wants to leave it open. India has a map for the UN that claims the whole of Kashmir. Pakistan has a map for the UN that claims the whole of Kashmir. But Pakistan does not include New Delhi, and New Delhi, India, does not include Rawalpindi. Israel does not give a map. It leaves it open. 7, Israel is the only country in the world which is not a state of its citizens. Please understand what I mean. It is a Jewish state. It is not a state of its citizens. The Islamic State of Saudi Arabia, the Islamic State of Pakistan, the Islamic State there are not the state of all Muslims. They're the state of the Saudis, they're the state of the Pakistanis or the Malaysians. But Israel is a state of Jewish people all over the world, but will not a state of the own non-Jewish people that live under it. It's extraordinary. And lastly, it is the only settler colonial apartheid state that remains in the world today. South Africa is over. In fact, there have been 3 kinds of settler colonial states that we've had. The first, North America, South America, Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, the European settlers and all came and finished off the population. The second type, in Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Algeria. A minority European settlers come there, they dominated. The majority are, of course, the indigenous people, and eventually their rule of the minority is overthrown. Israel is the third kind of settler colonial state. It is there. Its population is only slightly more than the population of Palestinians in the occupied territories, and within Israel itself, this is still unresolved. It's not like the second type, but it cannot do what the first type did also, even though they are trying very much in Gaza to move in that direction. Keep these in mind, because the Israel-Palestine issue is so simple and clear-cut. It's not complicated. You can say, well, Kashmir is complicated, this issue is complicated. Here, the difference between victims and victimizers is so straight that you don't have to be a Palestinian to see the justice of the Palestinian cause. In fact, to support the Palestinian cause is to actually do justice with what is decent and humane within ourselves. It is so simple. Let me come to the history of what we are talking about, Israel-Palestine conflict. And it starts with the emergence in the late 19th century of Jewish Zionism. I won't talk about Christian Zionism, but Jewish Zionism. Christian Zionism is much earlier. Jewish Zionism, which was a kind of response to the suffering of Jews in Eastern Europe and Tsarist Russia. And they wanted to move towards some kind of national liberation. But this national liberation struggle was very different from the national liberation struggles of the countries of Africa, of Asia, of Latin America, of India, Vietnam, and so on. All those national liberation struggles had to fight against colonial and imperial powers. But this attempted national liberation struggle, this Zionist struggle, recognized from the very beginning that it must align itself with imperialist powers in order to get what it wants. And first, of course, to align itself with Britain, the most important power, the imperialist power of his times, and then much later on, after the 1956 Suez Crisis, with, of course, the United States of America. It starts there. And this effort in the late 19th century began to bear fruit because of what took place later on, and that is World War I, where you had the Austro-Habsburg Empire, the Germans, and the Ottoman Empire, the Central Powers coming together against Britain, France, Italy, Japan, others here, and Russia at that time over here. And the British, in order to defeat the Ottoman Empire, which was also oppressing its own Arab population and wanting to get the support of the Arab people, made a commitment in 1915 that after the World War, in due course, we will support the formation of an independent Arab country or a federation of different Arab countries. That was a commitment by Britain. But in 1916, Britain and France have a secret meeting, and they say, after the war, we will divide these parts among us. The Russian Revolution exposed this secret treaty. And after that, the British said, no, we are committed to independence there. And at the same time, in November 1917, they had the famous Balfour Declaration, which promised a national homeland. National homeland, not a different state there, but a national homeland for the Jews. Why? Many reasons. Simple and most important reason for Britain, they will be there, Jews, and that will help us geopolitically after the war in the future for us to maintain our influence and dominance in that region. And that meant that they were going to promote the migration of Jews here. You had the League of Nations, which was formed, and the Balfour Declaration was accepted by it, but in the League of Nations, it was agreed that between France and Britain, that you will have mandates in this region. And what a mandate meant is that you are there as the mandated power, but in due course, all of these countries will become independent. So if you like, France was given Syria and Lebanon. Britain had a mandate over Palestine, Jordan, Iraq. India says we were among the first colonized countries to become independent, 1947. Iraq becomes independent in 1932. Lebanon in 1943. Syria and Jordan in 1946. All of these regions became independent before India did. The one part which did not get independence, which it was promised, was Palestine. Palestine, even before the end of the Second World War, fought one of the most courageous long-term struggles against British colonialism. In fact, between 1936 and 1939, Palestine launched a movement, a resistance struggle, which was the greatest struggle in the whole history of British colonialism. In 1936, there was a 6-month general strike. When that finished, there was resistance, armed resistance by the Palestinians against the British, who were allowing more and more migration and allowing the Jewish National Fund to be able to take more land, or to dismiss here, all that. And that struggle was very important, and the British had to fight with 100,000 troops. It took them to finish it off, and they supported the Zionist Jewish troops there, and that is how, in fact, you had the first formation of Jewish military groups of various kinds. The Haganah, which was part of the army, but also other groups of various kinds, terrorist groups of various kinds, they got at. And that defeat of the Palestinians, in fact, rendered them unable later on to launch a strong enough resistance against the British and against what was happening because of the Zionist cause. So at the end of First World War, you have originally there were Jews who were living there, about 6-7%, or earlier on, were always been there before the migration took place, with about 2% of the land of Palestine. You then have migration, and the migration is around about 18% people have come in now, Jews here, by about 1929, 1932. Hitler comes to power in 1933, and there is a massive increase of migration and taking over of land. And that's why you had 1936-39 war. And at the end of the Second World War, you had about a third of the population being Jewish, but they still only had around 8-9% of the land. After the end of the Second World War, Britain hands over the issue of Palestine to the UN, which is dominated by two major powers, the US and the Soviet Union. And you had about 55 odd countries which were members of the UN at that particular time. And a special committee is formed to decide what to do about Palestine, 11-member committee. And you had 3 countries, India, Iran, and Yugoslavia, saying that there should be a united federation, respect culturally and so on, but a unified one country afterwards with cultural rights and so on. And a majority position which said partition it. And the partition was 1/3 of the population will get 55% of the land, that's the best land, the rest will get that. And the response of the Palestinians to this partition plan, which was only a recommendation, was, what are you talking about? We're supposed to get independence. The UN in November 1947 voted a majority that the recommendation for partition should take place. But do you know what happened 7 days to 10 days before that partition? Because Israel and the Zionists said, yes, yes. Not that they would be satisfied, but they had recognized that if we get this, it is a stepping stone for moving forward. Do you know what happened 10 days before the UN partition plan? There had been going on secret discussions and agreements and deals between King Abdullah of Jordan and the Zionist Golda Meir, mediated by the British. And 10 days before that, there was an agreement between the Zionists and King Abdullah of Jordan that, look, we will take all this, you have East Jerusalem and what was the West Bank. And in fact, in the war that took place after that, that was basically what happened. Do not think that these Arab countries, even now, their leaderships, their governments, there's a profound difference between them and the public, are that concerned about the Palestinian issue. That really is history. And between November 1947 and May 1948, when Israel becomes independent, you have 1/3 of the Palestinians ethnically cleansed, killed, and pushed out. And this was a deliberate strategy of Zionism. When we talk about Zionism as an ideology, remember there were 3 broad currents of Zionism. Political Zionism, secular, which was basically saying, we need our own state so that Jews can be protected. Second, a cultural Zionism, a cultural religious Zionism. We need an independent state so that Judaism can be protected. And if Judaism is protected, then the Jews there. And you had a third current, which was labor Zionism, in which you had a current of socialist Zionism. Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister here, was an admirer of Lenin. Huh? Incidentally, the first country to recognize legally Israel in 1948, 3 days after it declared independence, was the Soviet Union. But we can leave that aside for the moment here. You have these 3 currents. The labor Zionism, we want workers to be dominant. We want to have. They talked about the kibbutz. They talked about the Histadrut, the whole federation of unions. But please note that in this kibbutz, collective leading, and in the unions, Arabs and Arab workers were not allowed. In other words, you had differences within Zionism. But what was most important was what was common to all 3. And what was common to all 3? If we are to have a Jewish state, we must have a majority of Jews. Therefore, the whole question of ethnic cleansing was central to all aspects of the Zionist project. You had 1/3 after between November and 1948, and then when the war took place and the Arab countries came, also for their own ambitions, the Jordanians in particular wanted to see and show, which I mentioned already, etc. here. You had, of course, a resistance which was far more successful by the Israelis because their armed training and all that had taken place between 36, 39 was much more, and they had much better arms. And do you know where the arms came, which were able to defeat the Arabs countries, with only Egypt carrying the Gaza Strip and Jordan getting what I was, East Jerusalem and that, as had been discussed earlier. They got the arms from Czechoslovakia with the endorsement of the Soviet Union. One question you might want to ask yourself is, why is it that the Soviet Union supported Israel? We can take that up later on if you want. And why in 1950, when Nehru recognized Israel, that there was no difference and no opposition from the left in India, because Soviet Union had recognized it here. But we can take those matters up separately. You had, after 1948 to 1949, massive expulsion, deliberate expulsion. And the Palestinians have been saying that we must have the right of return. In 1949, when Israel became a member of the UN, the condition of the UN was that there must be the right of return, UN Resolution 194, which Israel has never abided by. The period from after coming in and expelling and then taking over the homes, all that, 70%, 75% of Palestinians were expelled to other territories and the West Bank and Gaza and the other countries over there. And you have had since then from 1948 right to today, please understand the basic logic of the Zionist project, which can be summed up in one simple sentence. That sentence is more land, less Palestinians. That has been the basic project. There are differences within the Zionist government, the Zionist leadership, how, when. Maybe we should make some adjustment here, maybe we can make some concession here, but overall, because we have to keep the US and the other supporters with us, and so on. But this has been the basic rhythm, with differences around this here, what here, but that's something to understand. So the 1956 Suez crisis of Britain, France, and US and Israel coming together was related to Britain being very angry because Nasser had come up in 1952, and this was the expression of Arab nationalism. He nationalized the Suez Canal, and Britain was very angry and opposed to this and wanted to overthrow Nasser. Nasser was supporting the Algerian struggle, like other countries, against France. And of course, Israel wanted more land. All three came together and they pushed. What stopped them was at that time the United States was competing with the Soviet Union for more support from the Arab world, and they had to push back when the United States and Soviet Union said, go back. And then they learned a lesson. Britain and France are declining powers. We need to get the US on our side. In 1967, what they called a preemptive war, we can discuss it. A preemptive war is a nice phrase to cover up the fact that you have started this war, basically. And although there were lots of tensions between the two, it was Israel that wanted it very much to see it expand, and they succeeded. The 6-day war, in which they took over the Golan Heights from Syria, and they took over, of course, the whole of the Sinai at that time, 67. And it is after 67 that the United States says, this Israel is very important. And since then, if you like, the US has been sitting on a kind of strategic stool. I use the word stool rather than chair, because a chair has its legs connected, right? A stool, there are just different legs, right? So you have 4 legs of this strategic stool on which the US sits. Israel is one leg. Saudi Arabia is another leg. Egypt is another leg. Turkey is another leg. What has been happening over time, however, is that this stool has become more like a chair, with the Egyptians coming closer to Israel, and Turkey also, in spite of tensions, this, that, here, and Saudi. But this has been something, and Israel is now so central towards that. What about the struggle of the Palestinians? 1964, the PLO is formed, but it is under the control of Egypt. It is only after 1967 that Fatah, Arafat, and others become a force independent from the Arab countries. Fatah, of course, wants the support of the Arab countries, but independent and prioritizing the rights and struggles of the Palestinians. And that PLO, which is an umbrella body, had not only Fatah, but other left groups of various kinds also. And then, because we are talking about the 60s, Vietnam is going on, national liberation struggles, all that, the Palestinians decide to have a guerrilla warfare and a guerrilla struggle. And this whole period from late 1960s till the late 70s is one in which you have all kinds of examples of hijackings, this encountering Israel in various ways. In many ways unjustified because of the killing of civilians, but what it did was it kept the issue alive. At the same time, it does not succeed. And in fact, there is a recognition by the Palestinians that this is not succeeding. And that what do we do now as we move towards that? This is particularly the case when you have in 1973 another war between Egypt and Syria to get back their territory. It's important. This was not a war so much in support of the Palestinians, but to get back their own territory. And after 1973, and the shock that Israel got at that time, because it was close to defeat, but the Egyptians were really fighting only to have a peace in which they would have an advantage. So they didn't even extend their war when they could have at a certain point of time. But things turned. You had the Americans massively helping the Israelis, and the Israelis surrounded the Egyptian army here. And that ended the war in a stalemate. And then both the US and Soviet Union say, no, no, stop it here. And what you have, Nasser dies in 1970. Saddam, Anwar Sadat, now looks to the US as the broker. And you have his visit in 1977-78 to Jerusalem. And it becomes very clear, and the Israelis recognize that, look, Egypt is the most powerful of the Arab countries. Let's get it out of the way. Let's have a treaty with them. They recognize us. We give them back the Sinai. Don't worry about Syria. Syria is much smaller. And although Syria and Egypt were fighting together, the Syrians were angry about Egypt, not ignoring them. But it's interesting. So you still have the Golan Heights under Israel. But the Palestinians don't come into the picture. You have this situation till the late 70s in which they are recognizing that the guerrilla war is not working. In order to fight the guerrilla war, the Palestinians had to fight from the neighboring countries, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon. Really, that's Egypt to a limited extent. But these are the countries. And as they were getting stronger within their own countries, because these are all dictatorships, you also had the governments of these Arab countries from time to time wanting to repress the Palestinians. And that really happens. And in fact, I won't go into the history of all that. So you had them expelled from Jordan and Syria, and they become very important in Lebanon. And because of that, you have the Israelis in 1982 invading Lebanon, going all the way to Beirut. This assault on Lebanon now is even worse than that, but the Palestinian leadership had to escape from Lebanon and settle in Tunis. Fatah and was the dominant force, but other forces also in the PLO. They had to move out in 1982. I mention this because on one hand, Fatah begins to think about some diplomatic approach, and they're saying, okay, once upon a time, our goal was one Palestine, which is secular, and in which Jews will also have rights here. And they say, now let's forget about it. Let's just settle for the 22% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Yes, it was very wrong, but of course we must have the right of return and so on, all that. But they said, okay, let us settle for that. This gets reinforced because something happens in 1987, which is very, very important. 1987 was the first intifada within the occupied territories, which is not led by Fatah, not led by any of the left groups, but was indigenous from the occupied territories and not led by Hamas. Hamas was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and when it saw what happened in 1987, the Intifada, it says, okay, forget about the Muslim Brotherhood, we are a Palestinian force, and they call themselves Hamas, which basically meant Islamic resistance force in Palestine. And this was led indigenously, in which young people and women played a very big role in rural Palestine. So much so that 1/3 of the casualties were women. And this is something that shook Arafat and Fatah, because it was an indication of a newer leadership that was emerging. And this also then promoted Fatah and others to say, okay, we should try to co-opt that leadership because we are the representatives of the Palestinian people. One of the great tragedies of the Palestinian people is that a very remarkable people have not always had the kind of leadership that they deserve. whether we are talking about Hamas or whether we are talking about Fatah and others. This is something that we have to also keep in mind. Anyway, that is why in '88 you have Arafat coming to the UN and say that we will have peace, the US being a big broker and all, and you have your Oslo Accords, which was a sellout. In fact, before the Oslo Accords, Edward Said, many says, okay, we can have peace, let's have this then, fine. Most Palestinians were agreeing to this. But it should be a just settlement. And three things were very, very important. But the Israelis from the very beginning knew what they wanted. And what actually happened in Al-Fatah was Oslo Accords in 1993-94 was a sellout. Arafat and the PLO gave their most important weapon, the diplomatic recognition of Israel's existence and its independence as state here. But Israel did not recognize the right of Palestinians to their own state. They only recognized that the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people. So you have the Palestinian leadership recognizing Israel's, but Israel not recognizing that. And it said other matters like the right of return of Palestinians, other matters like the boundaries, they had already carried out illegal settlements. In the mid-1990s, they had even carried out this whole wall to make Gaza an open-air prison. We will discuss this in 5 years. By 1999, we will sort these out. This was a sellout. Because the right of return is something that is absolutely fundamental. You are not going to have any just resolution of the Palestinian issue unless you address the question of the right of return in 1948 for all of those to come back. Why is this so important? Let's understand. Most of these are living in different parts of the world, neighboring countries, USA and all. They all want that Israel must accept the right of return. Must accept the right of return, which is different from saying that everybody must come back. So when Israel says, oh, we can't have everybody coming back and all, that's not the issue. Why is the right of return so important? Because you cannot have new relations and coexistence between Palestinians and Zionist Israelis until this is accepted. What do I mean by this? Do you think you can have coexistence and acceptance between the whites of South Africa and the non-whites of South Africa if the white apartheid regime did not recognize and accept that apartheid is wrong? Can you have new relations between a colonizing country like Britain and India if Britain does not accept that, okay, we are wrong, get out? It is the political question, the political symbolic question of the right of return. Not everybody must come back. You can negotiate about it. You can talk about compensation. But you cannot have that. If you do not have that acceptance of right of return, there cannot be a change in the fundamental relation. Why? What does Israel tell its population? The formation of Israel is the rectification of a great injustice done to the Jewish people in Europe. That's why we must have Israel. What they are not prepared to accept, even if you accept this, is that the very formation of Israel is a profound injustice to the Palestinian people. How on earth can you expect new relations between the two if the Israelis are not prepared to accept that? And it is very difficult for them to accept that. And yet, that is what the right of return means. 1993-94, you have the Oslo Accords. Between 93 and 1994, Oslo 1 and 2, you already have settlements expanding. The violation of Oslo Accords is here. And in fact, what has happened after the Oslo Accords is that Fatah and the Palestinian Authority, which was set up there, is actually a subcontractor for the Palestinians. And this is, in fact, a tragedy. for the Palestinians, a central part of their leadership is now acting as a subcontractor. And the tension between Hamas and Fatah is very real. And even the China broker deal, which is recently, has not really resolved it. 1998, Hamas is formed. It has a charter which is anti-Semitic. But it has recognized the failure, the mistake that Fatah did, and what it offers is something else. It offers what it calls a hudna, a long-term hudna, a truce. Fatah has also, Hamas has also changed. Hamas was first a wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's set up in Gaza, in particular. It's set up, and to some extent West Bank, is set up a whole network, not just of mosques, but of all support structure of welfare kind and all that here. So when you talk about Hamas today, it's not just its armed wing. It has a propaganda wing, it has an administrative wing, it has a health wing, it has a schools, college wing, schools wing, it's everything. But once you name somebody terrorist, right, then automatically everybody is terrible, terrible. And this is the importance of language. You call it terrorist, you can do everything. Pakistan is terrorist. Does the Indian state carry out terrorism? Which is the country that has killed more civilians outside of its country in the world than all the rest of the world put together after 1945? The United States of America. It has killed several millions of innocent civilians. Anybody call the United States of America a terrorist state? Hamas is a terrorist state, and yes, it should not have killed civilians, but the terrorist campaign that Israel is doing? No. This is where the media comes in. This is where the intellectuals come in. It's where the administration comes in. All that comes in. The use of language to cover up. And now this bogey about Islamic terrorism. Please note, you have Muslims who are terrorists, you have Sikhs who are terrorists, you have Jews who are terrorists, you have Hindus who are terrorists and all. You have lots of secular terrorists also. But when you say Islamic terrorism, have you ever heard of Christianic terrorism? Have you ever heard of Buddhistic terrorism? Have you ever heard of Sikhistic terrorism? What's my point? My point is when you say Islamic terrorism, you're connecting automatically a religion with terrorism. So this question of the use of language to do that, and it works. Look at the Indian media, look at the other media in terms of how they talk about it. But Hamas has also learned that its strategy of trying to do Islamic and its social, cultural program is nothing to be appreciated at all. In fact, one should be very critical of it here. But it has also learned that it cannot really think that what it did before in its early phase and all. And it has changed its perspective and even changed its charter to say that we are not against the Jewish people. And they actually moved. And when they moved in a more moderate direction, when in 2006, the last elections in the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, what is called the Palestinian Legislative Assembly took place, to everybody's surprise, Hamas won, because unlike Fatah, they have not been a caretaker. They're at least a force of resistance there. And that, of course, shook Fatah, it shook Israel, it shook the US. And very shortly after that. But when President was Abbas, at that time of Fatah, the Prime Minister was Ismail Haniyeh, who was a moderate. And Ismail Haniyeh wrote a letter to George Bush in that time saying, look, we are prepared to have a long-term Hudna truce along these lines that we have here. You talked about. He didn't say that we will accept this thing here, but he indicated that after a long-term truce and all, we are also prepared to accept that this becomes part and this becomes indicated. But the question was, for various reasons, they said no, 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 and they actually moved. And the end result of that civil war situation was that Gaza was under Hamas and Fatah here. And since 2000, since the late 2000, in fact in 2000, I mentioned 1999, you had this, what do you call it, supposed to have final status negotiations about right of return, removal of settlements and all that. What you actually had when nothing took place, you had in 2000 the second intifada. in the occupied territories over here, which also shook them. And this also promoted people like Ariel Sharon, because the right and the religious right in Israel is also becoming stronger and stronger. And they, of course, moved. And in 2003, they took a decision, actually about 2004-05, that we will make Gaza an open-air prison. The 8,000 Jewish settlers who are in Gaza, but the security forces of Israel captured about 35-40% here. We will take them out. They produce more than 8,000 settlers in other parts of the West Bank, and they made it a kind of open-air prison. And since then, you've had Palestinian struggles of various kinds. And you've also had systematically air assaults by the Israelis on Gaza and the expansion of settlements in the West Bank in various forms, violent, and there's been violence, obviously, towards that. And this has, of course, been the situation there. And even though the Oslo Accords were being defied and violated, nobody cared. India doesn't bloody care. Who cares? The Arab countries caring? The European countries? They were just carrying on. And in fact, what was happening till very recently was the normalization of relations between many of the Arab countries and Israel. So you had the Abraham Accords. Abraham Accords, in which you have, of course, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and UAE now accepting the accords here. And the key prize is, of course, Saudi Arabia, so that they could move towards that. Now what has happened because of October 7th, that has been halted. But please note something. After October 7th and the genocide that is taking place, what have the Arab countries done? They had big meeting. Not a single one of the Arab countries has repudiated the Abraham Accords. The Arab countries and Iran together and come together can use their oil weapon to put tremendous pressure on that. Has that been done? No. Why? You have to understand that these are all dictatorships. And maintaining their dictatorship is more important. They have to pay a lot of lip service and give money to the Palestinian cause. But there is a tension between these governments, class and otherwise, and your own public. Because what is happening in the Arab world and elsewhere, like everywhere else, is a desire for greater democracy and democratic rights. So what have you had? Have you forgotten the Arab uprisings? They took place, so many cases. Unfortunately, the overall result of that is things are bad. But even after 2013, when Sisi comes back here, you had explosions in Syria, you have it in Libya, you have it in other places, Algeria. Don't think that the people in this part of the world who have suffered the longest stretch of dictatorships of any other part of the world for decades and decades are simply going to accept it. They're going to rise up. Whether they'll be successful or not is a different question, but they're fighting. And those governments at the top here want to devour them, and they are more interested in maintaining the kind of relationship which will help them to dominate that. And in fact, there are very close relationships financially and otherwise between them. And within the Arab world, you have this Middle East world or West Asian world, you have a lot of tension between Iran and the Arab countries in the Gulf sector. So this becomes more important in many ways than the question of what they will do with regard to Israel. So these are all real problems. What happened in October 7th is that everything got shaken. Why did Hamas do what it did? For a number of reasons. One is the whole question of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is being hammered, and as the religious right and far right is grown, there are more and more voices in Israel saying that it's not just a question of extending the wall and making things more difficult and restricting entry from time to time for worship by Muslims in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site of Muslims. It is the most holy site of Jews. The Temple Mount, it's there. We should break it. Yes, they're talking about breaking it. And you had in 2022 the assault and others by, on the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the demonstration that took place over there. So this concern is one. Lots of Israeli Zionists are saying, we have such a large population of prisoners of this thing. Why not execute some of them? Incidentally, this is the only democracy in the world that tries minors in military courts. So why not we do that? Third, we must separate Gaza from the West Bank, because Judea and Samaria, the West Bank is important. Gaza is not that important. We must separate it permanently. So forget about even a two-state solution. We must expand our settlements in the West Bank in particular. We'll see what we can do about Gaza, the difference of view here. All of these things, and of course we must move towards greater normalization and all that here with the other countries. This has all shaken it up now. But the overall result is what? What now, and what is the way forward? One, despite this resistance, Israel was always looking for an excuse to move ahead. And strategically, this has been a big setback. There are certain positive things that have emerged. One, you have had now for the first time among civil societies everywhere, a greater recognition about the racist, exclusivist, and ugly character of Zionism. This idea that Israel is under threat has been shaken as never before. You have more and more people and associations in civil society that say what is happening is horrible. Governments always want two things from the public. All governments, Democrats or whatever. They want the freedom to do whatever they decide. That's one, our policies. Second, they want the legitimization of those policies. So your BJP government here, this government there, ye hum kar rahe hain. We want freedom. Don't mess around with us. We don't want your big demonstrations that force us to change our policies. At the same time, we want you to accept what you do here. And for that, of course, you have your diplomats, you have your intellectuals, you have your media, this, that, to try and do that. What's happened for Israel is that in more and more countries and more public, they don't have that legitimacy. But that's only one part of the struggle to try and change and defeat them over here. And I would say something, and I'm not a Gandhian. There is a place for armed struggle in liberation struggle, but you have to be careful where and in what context. So for example, the armed struggle against the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan has had success and importance in pushing them out. What's happened to the United States of America after Vietnam in particular and elsewhere is that their capacity to throw violence is reaching infinity. Their capacity to accept the deaths of soldiers is asymptotically going towards 0 and 0. They can't afford soldier body bags because of the resistance. Most Americans will be pro the American government, but not this. But in the case of Palestine, my view is that you have to have a new leadership which, even as it recognizes the use of physical force to defend itself and families from what Israelis are doing, must not use it as an offensive strategy. You have to give up your offensive military strategy. You cannot defeat Israel militarily. It's very easy for me to say this, and I feel very embarrassed to say this. Because even as I say this, and I say this to Palestinian friends and all, I'm not the one that is going to get beaten and killed, even if they accept this strategy, which I hope that they would. And many people in Palestine and in leadership are saying that we must move in this direction. The Israelis will still kill many of them. But this is still the way to go, because there is no way that Israel can then say that, oh, they are threatening our right to exist. And that here. In other words, the settler colonial apartheid character, the struggle forward must be to oppose the apartheid character first. It's up to the Palestinians to decide a two-state solution or a one-state democratic secular Palestine or Israel or whatever you want to call it. Up to them to decide. I have my own views about it here, which we can discuss. I think the two-state solution is not on. But everywhere, there should be the fight for rights and equality and justice. And this is very important because it connects a whole series of struggles, which I'll come to, because I think this is the way to move forward. But let me just say something about what is likely to happen now and what are the problems that are taking place right now. Israel is expanding the war, and it is telling the United States, and the United States is listening, yeah, this is an opportunity for us to hammer Iran, to change the situation in the Arab world, which will benefit us. After all, what is Saudi Arabia and others doing? So we should use this opportunity. In Lebanon, they are very clear. They want to take a chunk of southern Lebanon. That is what is south of the Litani River, which is 70% Shia and others. About the breakup of Lebanon, I can tell you in the questions if you like here. They are more wary of extending their ground troops deeper into Lebanon. Airstrikes, fine. But deeper into Lebanon, that's trickier. They could lose a lot and they don't want to do that. But at least to have this substantial buffer and weaken Lebanon as much as they can. They're attacking Syria. They're attacking Yemen, the US in particular. And of course, what's the other place? Lebanon, yeah, and Iran. Yeah. And Iran is tricky. The Iran Obama did a deal with the Iranians on the nuclear issue. Iran said, we will not make nuclear weapons, let's have the deal. That was removed. Do you know that Israel was very opposed to the Obama deal, which prevented and which the Iranians agreed that they will not move towards nuclear weapons? Why was Israel opposed to that? They said it's too lenient. Why is it too lenient? Because it allows Iran to have it for peaceful purposes. In other words, Israel is saying this country must not even have the capacity or even the potential capacity to ever make nuclear weapons, even though not all countries that have nuclear energy go ahead to make nuclear weapons. So it sees that here. It plays on the Arab-Iranian conflict. Since the US is also very critical of Iranians' influence there, it's the most populated country there and has a military strength and so on, it sees some value and it says maybe we can take advantage of this situation. In the Gaza, there is a difference between the US and the Israelis. Because at some time, I don't know when, at some time this war will stop. What will happen to Gaza after that? The situation in Gaza is terrible. It is becoming uninhabitable. The number of people who are going to die and be killed is going to greatly increase because of epidemics and because of starvation. And some Israeli generals are saying we must promote this. But if the war stops, there will be aid that is coming in, and there'll have to be a great deal of reconstruction and all that. But those Israelis that wanted the Gazans to be expelled, to get out into Egypt, that's not happened. Egypt has said, no, we won't allow that. So one is to now squeeze them smaller so as to make the miserable prison in which they're living even more smaller and terrible. So they're demanding electoral. But there is a question of who will be the government governing there. And there it is very interesting. The Israelis say, we don't want the Palestinians to be governing there. We want to have control. The Americans are saying, no, no, no. We have to have some of the Arab countries to come as part of the governing body. The UAE has been willing to consider this, UAE. And then the Americans are saying, but you do have to have some fig leaf. So Fatah should also be there as an governing body, and the Israelis are saying no. So there are differences of this kind over here. But the larger project in West Bank, more and more settlements here, and you have a division within the Israeli Zionists and all, with more and more people saying, let's push them out more. Let's kill more of them in Abzaba. Let more of them die. And in the West Bank, let's move further and further and further. Forget about what the views are here. We have a chance to do that over here. It's difficult to see what's going to happen over there. But the only way forward is that you have to change the relationship of forces, and you have to unite the Palestinian people, and more than the Palestinian people, in order to move ahead. And this is what, lastly, I'm going to talk about here very briefly here. And that is that, look, you have to have a newer kind of a leadership, which recognizes that you have to form basically a non-violent strategic approach, and the focus should be the question of rights and justice and equality. And many pro-Israeli liberals in the United States, and not just them, are worried if the Palestinians simply say that, look, we are now committed to a non-violent struggle for justice and equality, because that will make it very difficult for Israel to say, oh, we are being under threat. They're asking for democratic rights. You call yourself a democratic country and all that. They're worried. That's the whole question of fighting against apartheid. But you also have to not just change the goal and demand. You have to have, as I said, a new leadership. Temporarily, can there be a unification of the existing leadership, Hamas and that, which could help in some ways? I won't talk about that. I've already talked too much. I'm afraid that we Indians always love to talk a lot. A friend of mine who is head of all sorts of international meetings says that, a British chairperson, he says that every international meeting I have only two problems: how to get the Japanese delegate to start speaking, and how to get the Indian delegate to stop speaking. But my point here is that this, how do you change the path to liberation for Palestine passes through Cairo and Amman. You have to shift the relationship of the countries around that. If you fight for equality and rights, what are the people who want more equality and rights? The Palestinians who are within Israel are second-class citizens. They want greater equality and rights. Those within the occupied territories want greater equality and rights. Those public in the Arab world and in Persia, Iran, want greater equality and rights. So if you are pursuing this, you are actually providing a basis for the unification of all of these forces to come together on a common perspective to fight. And I promise you that if one significant Arab country's dictatorship is overthrown, and it is there, and it sustains itself as some kind of a liberal democratic, even though capitalist country, this will change the whole picture. The United States will also recognize that Israel is not that important for it strategically. It can change a lot of the picture, and it can have a knock-on effect in other parts of this thing here. In other words, these struggles must be connected together. And one other positive development that has taken place now is that the Palestinian diaspora is now going to play a much bigger role wherever they are, whether in the Western countries or in the Arab countries nearby, and also spreading it. And what is truly amazing about the Palestinian people is that generation after generation of generation, wherever they are, remain committed to the Palestinian cause. And I think that this is the one way to forward, to try to bring that together here. And this too can also help to develop something that is also important, but has now become much weaker in Israel itself, and that is the left. The left in Israel is much weaker. And you have among Jews in the Western countries and the Jews in Israel, very different. The younger generation in the Western countries are more and more anti-Zionist and critical of Israel. But the younger generation in Israel is worse than its parents and grandparents in terms of becoming more right-wing and post-Zionist. We elders sometimes are not so bad. Huh? But I'm saying that this is a problem that's taking place. But the change in the relationship elsewhere that can have a very real effect. So I think this is the way forward. It's going to be a long struggle. It's still going to continue. But, as I said earlier on, Israel cannot do what the first type of settler colonial regimes did in terms of eliminating the people over there. In fact, they can squeeze them, they can do that. But that commitment to struggle is something that is very, very important. And the responsibility for all of us is, of course, that elsewhere we must give solidarity and support to that struggle. And the way that we give solidarity and support is not simply the easy way of criticizing and attacking the Western government or Israel. It's also a question of us doing what we must do against our own governments, wherever we are, Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, whatever, in the Arab world, to fight against that. And as I said, and I will end it here, to me, this Palestine issue is really the test of our own basic decency and humanity. If we don't stand up for the Palestinian people, we demean and we debase ourselves and all, even if it's not that much, which is good and decent within ourselves. Thank you very much.